For today's video, we are going to finally try and answer one of the more annoying questions that have come up over this decade when it comes to the roguelike genre. And that is, what is the difference between a roguelike and a roguelite? And why does that matter when it comes to game development? The roguelike genre has been one of the more fascinating aspects to grow from the PC and independent space over this past decade, but it has really been a far larger genre than that. And it's one of the reasons why I'm basing one of my future books entirely on it. But, as a brief bit of history, the game that kind of first popularized the roguelike genre, or rogues in general, was the game called Rogue, which is building off of pre-existing games in terms of procedural generation, random areas, and of course permadeath difficulty. Rogue led to the game Hack, which was then re-released as NetHack. I believe that was in 1987, and NetHack is considered to be one of the greatest examples of the roguelike genre. And throughout the 90s and early 2000s, we've seen whether they are established roguelikes in the RPG genre, as well as many games that borrow from it. We could maybe call them roguelike adjacent titles on console and PC. But in terms of the subgenre really blowing up, that didn't occur until really this past decade with games such as The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, and of course FTL over there. And with these titles, they all had elements of the roguelike design. Procedurally generated game spaces, very challenging, and of course permadeath difficulty. But none of the three games had anything in terms of RPG layering to them, as in the case with Rogue, NetHack, and games like that. And this is when we began to see this distinction between a roguelike and a roguelite. And well, this has become a very popular question to troll people, and I am sure right now of a few of the comments that are showing up in the live stream that's showing up somewhere on this video. But there is a legitimate question or a legitimate design that we can discuss when it comes to roguelike and roguelite design. Because despite people trying to troll, it does matter when it comes to the design and focus of these games. So for this video, we're going to split into kind of two parts. We're going to focus on roguelikes here, and then we'll move on to roguelites in the second part. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be slurring or mixing up the two. We'll see what happens. But roguelikes are games that are focused more on each individual run itself, as opposed to an overlying or over-focused campaign. So with FTL over there, I can play that game 50, 100, 200 different times, and get that same amount of different experiences. Roguelikes, as well as with the original Rogue and NetHack, are built on a high degree of variance. And if you missed our previous talk, variance is simply a way to describe the number of different and legitimate ways that a game can play out. Whether it's by focusing on range versus melee, stealth versus action, fire mage, ice mage, you get the picture. And roguelikes have a very high degree of variance in them because there is very little carryover between runs. And when we say carryover, we're talking about anything that can affect one run that's brought to a next or subsequent run. And keep that in the back of your mind because we're going to be referring to that when we get to roguelites. Now, while roguelikes can have some persistent elements to them, FTL unlocks additional ships, Binding of Isaac has all its secrets, Spelunky has the shortcuts. They are not really changing or affecting subsequent runs of the game. A new ship doesn't mean that I'm going to start off with a better or worse advantage, or advantage or disadvantage. It just means a different way of starting. In The Binding of Isaac, all that variance creates very individualized runs, and that is one of the cornerstones of a roguelike. That every time I play the game, I should be getting a different experience. And designing a game around that is way too big for our video today. And as always, if you'd like me to elaborate on any of the topics we discussed, let me know in the comments below. But when you're trying to build a roguelike, you are not building your game towards a quote-unquote ending. Meaning, if I beat Spelunky, or if I beat The Binding of Isaac or FTL, the game is over, right? No. That just simply means that run ended successfully. But we can have all manner of crazy and different solutions take place in the next run, in the next one, and so on and so on. And that is one of the cornerstones of roguelike design. Besides procedural generation and permadeath difficulty, these runs have to feel legitimately different. And that sounds very simple when I put it like that, but when we talk about roguelites next, I almost said roguelike there, we're going to see why this is a lot harder than it sounds, even if your game has randomly or procedurally generated environments. And the reason why the idea of a roguelike has grown so popular this past decade is that these elements of permadeath difficulty, procedural generation, and again, a huge amount of variance, are just really great design loops when they can be fit into different genres. We probably don't have the time to talk about it here, but in a very odd way, the whole rise of the Souls-like in mainstream developers and AAA games is a very clear indicative example of this. And one of the strangest comparisons, Dark Souls is probably closer to a roguelite than it is a roguelike. Again, take a shot every time I say either roguelike or roguelite today. And the reason why is what we'll talk about next when it comes to the roguelite genre. But regardless of what kind of rogue we're talking about, you have to be really mindful of the kind of design you're trying to build. Because if you think that people are going to stick around for a roguelike, but you don't have enough elements, you don't want to call your game that specific subgenre. And again, a lot of developers these days will call anything with random or procedural generation a roguelike. But after this quick shout out to our Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors, we're going to switch things over and talk about a roguelite, and why this has become the standard definition for, or the standard genre qualifier for many of these supposed roguelikes. And I'm sure I'm going to be saying rogue about a few dozen more times in our next part. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom Patreon supporters and sponsors. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. When it comes to talking about roguelite design, it's one of those things that it can be very hard to kind of understand the difference between the two. But having played so many of these games over this decade, I think I finally settled on an established pattern of design and elements for it. So when we talk about roguelite games, they are focused more on an established end, as opposed to a run-by-run basis. Usually roguelites have either a greater focus on the story side of things, or there's just not as much of a difference in terms of runs. One of the major cornerstones of a roguelite is the persistent element, and you're seeing that here with Hades right now on screen. There are a lot of unlockables in this game. Passives that will improve your character going forward, new weapons, being able to get new trinkets that can help you, and this is one of the major points of a roguelite game, that you are playing to get better at subsequent runs. In the last part, I mentioned the term carryover, and how from roguelikes, they do not have as much carryover, or even next to zero, or next to none, in terms of a carryover effect. Each run is essentially its own unique beast. Nothing I do on run A should influence run B, C, D. In a roguelite, that is clearly on display. When we're looking at Hades here, as I collect more of that purple resource, the 1 in the right hand corner of the screen there, I can make our character here legitimately better. This is not a case of side grades or changing how things work. It's basically saying, if I could do 20% more damage on this run than I did on a previous run, that's a very big deal. And roguelites in general have this focus that you're trying to play towards an ending. And each run will kind of serve to get you to it. Another big example is Rogue Legacy, which is 100% a roguelite, because no matter how much the game tries to change things, you are kind of at the mercy of the procedural elements. And this is a very big deal. Roguelikes tend to have a very baseline balance in terms of enemy stats and their abilities. Yes, things are going to grow harder, but it's not a case of having to bring in anything else as backup. With roguelites, these games are typically designed around the scaling of the persistent elements. What that means is that you're going to fight enemies at some point that are going to be so difficult that either it's going to take a tremendous amount of skill to get through it, or you have to grind the persistent element to have any chance. And this is a very big problem when it comes to some of the lesser examples of roguelite gameplay. That you literally are not able to beat the game on your very first run. You simply don't have the persistent elements in your favor. With games like FTL, Spelunky, and The Binding of Isaac, they are balanced and kind of imbalanced in a way that you could theoretically win on your first play. It's usually not going to happen because you don't have the knowledge to back that up. But there's nothing in the game space itself that is making you lose, if that makes any sense. And this has been one of the major points with this distinction between a roguelike and a roguelite. That with a roguelike, when I win, that simply means I can go do another run. Again, there are people who are in the hundreds, if not thousands, of plays of titles like Spelunky, FTL, and The Binding of Isaac, and they're still getting new ways of playing. But with games like Hades, Rogue Legacy, and even something like Dead Cells, despite how great it is, there's not a lot of variance here. And this goes back to a previous point that I made, that a lot of people look at random or procedural generated content and think that by itself is the magic factor that makes these games replayable. But the problem is that randomized or procedurally generated game spaces, just by that token, does not create variance. And this is something that we need to drill into more people's heads in terms of what it means to make a roguelike or a roguelite. Hades here is another example. While each run is different in terms of what environments I'm going into, these rooms are all handmade. So even if you change enemies in them, I'm still having the same basic strategies. There is no growth in terms of what enemy encounters I fight. Every situation kind of plays out the same way. And there's very little room to pivot in terms of changing your strategy or getting something monumental. The only thing that really matters in the grand scheme of things when you're playing a game like Hades is your primary weapon. And this is another popular aspect of roguelite games, that they'll give you like a few basic choices or a few basic variables that really change how you play, and then nothing else that happens during the middle of a run. In a game like FTL, for instance, that getting the right module or a great weapon can completely change your entire strategy going forward. Now, Spelunky is of course the odd man out, but Spelunky is kind of its own unique beast in this equation because of its focus on skill-based gameplay with procedurally generated levels. For the majority of roguelikes, however, that As you play them, you may get some crazily, stupidly overpowered set of mechanics or options that will completely affect how you play the game, just as things can go completely pear-shaped, and you may get something that makes you worse. But again, the beauty of a roguelike is the fact that every run is different. Just because one run turns out completely weird and different, doesn't mean it's going to happen the same way the next time. But roguelites tend to focus on a very slow or very quick, depending upon your own skill level, progression curve. With Hades here, I'm going to be uploading footage of me beating the final boss, or the quote-unquote final fight in Hades while it's in early access. And this fight took me, in terms of the persistent layer, about 4 runs of playing to have enough of that in my corner to beat the game. Now, does that mean everybody can play Hades with that low amount of runs? No. Just as I'm sure there's someone who could beat Hades on 1 run, or even doing it on a second or third one as well. I know when we spoke about Rogue Legacy, there are people who have managed to speed run or exploit the game to do it as quickly as possible. And that is a really good design, and it's one of the great things about having those persistent layers. However, that does not constitute a roguelike. And as I said in the last part, it's important from a design standpoint to understand what your focus is going to be, and then having to capitalize on it. Because if you try to do kind of half in one area and half in the other, it's not going to work out for you. As in, we're going to try to make a roguelike and give you huge variance, but we're still going to save a lot of the elements on the persistence side. And you have to be very careful about that. The problem is, for a roguelike, you need to focus heavily on variance. That doesn't mean just having a lot of hand-generated rooms. It means designing the mechanics and gameplay loops in question that can deliver completely different runs on each playthrough. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we're changing the gameplay loop itself, but again, somebody who plays a Bind of Isaac and gets Dr. Fetus as their main attack is going to have a different time playing it if they got Brimstone, or got the everybody's favorite, the Lemonade, or what was it? I think it was a gluten-free milk or something along those lines. But when I play a game like Hades or other roguelites, that there's nothing that is really changing the run itself. But then on the other hand, if you're trying to design a roguelite, then you have to focus on those persistent elements. You want the player to always be essentially looking at the next carrot on the stick that they're going to unlock. Maybe it's a new weapon. Maybe it's unlocking a new function that's going to appear in subsequent runs. Maybe it's even adding in a new boss fight or new elements that change things going forward. But you need to have a lot of these elements in play, because again, the runs themselves are not going to be differing. I'm still running through the same biomes, I'm fighting the same enemies, so you have to do something else. And if you can't deliver on either full-on variance or a very effective progression curve, then you're going to end up with a lesser roguelike, light, Souls-like, Dark-like, whatever you want to call it. And like I said, there is a lot more that we can go into detail about. I'm not looking at a clock right now, but I can already feel like this is going to be running on the longer side of these videos. And again, that's because these kinds of designs are very challenging to make. This is not a genre for somebody who's never designed a video game before. You don't want your first game to be a full-on procedurally generated design. I'm sure a few developers right now just got a sharp migraine in their head with me suggesting that. And with that said, though, it still has become a very popular genre because, as we've said, the roguelike elements of variance or the roguelite design of persistence are very effective gameplay loops. These are not bad elements in games. They add so much to them when they're done right. Again, the Souls-like genre is a very clear example of this. But it's not a design that you can just play around in and expect it to work. As we've talked about before, procedural generation in of itself, that you cannot think going into making a game that's procedurally generated that you're just telling the game to do all the content work for you. It is far more complicated than that, believe you me. With all that said though, thank you for watching this video. Again, if there's any parts of these you want me to elaborate on in another piece, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Check out the Discord and Patreon link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.